Welcome to our series put on by the Ayn Rand Centre UK. We are delighted to be continuing with the psychology of the Fountainhead characters and delighted to be joined by Doctors Milgram and Bernstein. And, today we are going to be looking at possibly one of the greatest villains in literature history, Ellsworth Toohey. And I noticed, Shoshana, just even me saying that just now, there was a sort of strong response in your face. And I'm wondering what even that was just then.
Okay, well, what I was responding to was mentioning the word great in connection with Ellsworth Toohey, because there's a sense in which, of course, he's an extreme, but part of the nature of Ellsworth Toohey is that he is the enemy of all greatness.
Absolutely.
And so it's almost as if you told him, well, you're the greatest villain, he would say, well, maybe a villain, but don't call me great, because I don't like great people, and wouldn't want to see himself. Although, of course, he is, as I think Ayn Rand wrote in her notes, that he was the worst of all possible rats. So I think a superlative does make sense for him, but that was why I reacted, because of great.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I should have clarified one of the greatest written villains in that sense. And Andy, I see you smiling as well.
No, this whole discussion is great.
Yeah.
I was always, mildly disturbed by taking the term great, an honorific like great, and applying it to like the Depression, the Great Depression. So what was great about it? They're talking about obviously the depth of it. So it was the worst Depression. I do think he's the worst villain. And, to your point, Josh, I think he's the most brilliantly drawn and consequently greatest villain in world literature. I don't know anybody who even approximates him. There were great villains like Iago, but Toohey is so deep. Ayn Rand analyzes his character morally and psychologically to such a depth that I do think he's the most brilliantly drawn arch villain in literature. Shoshana, it's her field, not mine, although it's my favorite field. But I'm sure she could comment on it more on other villains. But I don't know anybody who really remotely compares to Toohey in the pantheon of villainy.
Well, he's the enemy of actual greatness, and I think that makes him an extreme. It makes him dangerous. It makes him a nihilist. And since a nihilist is the spokesperson for the zero, for nothing, and that's what he is. He wants to destroy everything.
Right, and I think we could make a case if we leave Atlas Shrugged aside, because the book is sui generis. But I think we can make a case that Howard Roark is the greatest hero in literature, and he deserves the greatest villain. In fact, he needs the greatest villain to oppose him, and Toohey schemes to stop Roark, like the Stoddard Temple trial. They're just brilliant. I mean, they're absolutely brilliant. And his ability to enlist Dominique, Roark's lover, to his cause. I mean, it's brilliant. And the way Ayn Rand shows how much Toohey understands, and then juxtaposes it with the important points that he does not understand. Like, he can't possibly understand Dominique and the relationship that she and Roark have. He thinks Roark is an ascetic monk of architecture who would spurn her, and Dominique is acting against him because she's a woman scorned. He has no idea. He can't possibly. Since he doesn't hold any values, he can't possibly feel love and the passionate romantic love of Roark and Dominique. He has no conception of what their relationship actually is. So it's fascinating how much he understands, and yet how much of the important truths that he fails to and simply cannot understand.
I think that's actually a good point. That one of the things about no, of course, but I mean, I think it's a point that reaches to many things that Toohey does. He's especially good at getting an angle on people who are limited and who have weaknesses, and he goes after them. And people who have strengths, he sees them as a threat, but he doesn't know how to beat them. And so he really doesn't understand how to go after Dominique. And I think it's important that, and of course he doesn't know how to deal with Rourke, but even with Wynand, he thinks that he can have an impact on Wynand by sending him the statue of Dominique as a way to get Wynand to want to see Dominique. And Lance says, no, I don't want to know the name of the woman. I want to know the name of the sculptor. And right. Of course, it ends up he's interested in the woman as well. But that Toohey would even start thinking that way shows you that he doesn't understand Wynand, and that in fact, it could be that a statue would be greater than the model who inspired it, and that Wynand, who was interested in art, would be taken with the sculptor. So Toohey fails there too, in that he really doesn't understand what makes Wynand tick. He doesn't understand what makes Dominique tick. He doesn't understand really, you know, greatness in general, and that's why he specializes in people who were limited. And those are the ones he collects. Yeah, I think that's true.
So Andy mentioned the word, you know, the depth in relation to Toohey, and it really struck me when I reread the Fountainhead last year of just how deep a character he is, and how much Ayn Rand, you know, how much time she's puts into allowing us to really know kind of his childhood and, you know, many other aspects. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering whether you could expand on that, Shoshana, in terms of, you know, the depth of this character.
Okay, well, I think if you think of his depth in terms of how far back we go, one of the things that we see is that his soul was headed in a certain way from the beginning, and it wasn't because he had some traumatic experience that turned him evil. It was because whatever opportunities he had, he wanted to tear things down. And so we see him as a child teasing his aunt, of all people, you know, trying to hurt her. We see him trying to harm his parents. We see him trying to harm the popular boy at the school. We see that from Ellsworth Toohey's point of view, anyone else's prowess, success, goodness is something to be destroyed, is a target, and that's what he wants. And it's not as if he was influenced in this. You know, it's as if he may be in some ways the ultimate second-hander, but it's almost as if he came up with that from his own soul. Now, what Ayn Rand does, I think it's interesting, as you say, that she starts out with him as a child, because by contrast, we don't know much about Rourke's childhood. And yet I think we can infer that he was always the way that he was. We know a little bit about Dominique's childhood, the image of her, you know, jumping over the fence. We know something about Wynand's childhood because we see it, and also because he talks about it. But with Toohey, we've got a lot of details. And it's almost as if he remains throughout his life the boy who turns the hose on someone else, you know, the boy dressed up in nice clothes in order. Why? You know, why would he do that? What does he gain from that? And the notion that we have is that somehow, as he says, enjoyment is not his destiny. He doesn't enjoy things in the usual sense, which I think is why what Andy said about how he doesn't understand good people, he doesn't have values himself in the usual sense, something life-giving, something that would enrich his life. Instead, what he's focused on, destruction, on death, and hurting. That's what's interesting to him. And it's interesting to him in many different contexts. Now, what I think is very impressive about the story, and assuming that people who are listening to us know this, is that much in the way that superficially one might think of Peter Keating as being successful, conventionally appealing, and so on, one might think of Ellsworth Toohey as being conventionally good, you know, humanitarian. And I've taught the book a number of times, and I think if you're reading carefully, you can, especially as a child, you can see there's something wrong with him from the start. But sometimes people have the idea that if someone doesn't want anything for himself, he has to be good. And once you meet Ellsworth Toohey, you're going to be questioning that, because here's someone who says he doesn't want anything for himself, and yet look, you know, look at the way he spends his life. Look at the effect that he has on the students he advises, on other people. Being selfless is anything but a guarantee of virtue. Instead, it makes him the most dangerous person in the world, as indeed he says, when he runs into that police officer, you should arrest me, I'm dangerous. He is dangerous. So part of what I think Ayn Rand does that's brilliant with the character is two things. Well, at least two things. One is that you see the consistency of his behavior all the way through his life. And you also see that he's going by, you might say, rules of his own that you need to understand in order to see why he does the things that he does and why he is as destructive as he is. I guess the one little break is that when he tells Peter Keating that when he sees the agreement about Cortland between Peter and Rourke, he wants to destroy it. What is that about? And I think that, well, there could be two things. One is that in some ways it's just so obvious, it makes what he's doing easy. And something else is that from his point of view, it's almost as if that's, well, as if it's something he wants to say to Peter Keating, because he knows that Peter Keating would like him to destroy that. And so it's almost as if he's tormenting him with thinking, well, I could make this go away. And maybe there are other reasons too, but it's an interesting thing that he admits that there's some contradiction or conflict or disparity between the different things that he wants. But every time I read the book, on the one hand, I don't think that he's necessarily entirely real, someone who could actually be in the world.
It's interesting you say that, because I remember listening to Euron in a podcast and him saying that he noticed the evolution of Ayn Rand's villains from the Fountainhead to Atlas Shrugged. That he thought that maybe Toohey might not be able to exist, whereas James Taggart could easily exist. And it's interesting you say that as well in a sort of similar way.
Well, I think that Toohey is in the Fountainhead, as the complete opposite of Rourke, and in Atlas Shrugged, we've got more than one hero. So, from the point of view of plot structure, it wouldn't quite work for there to be one person who's the exact opposite of each of our great heroes. That would really, we don't have them matched up in that way. While Toohey really is the opposite of Rourke, because Rourke is the individualist, and his life and his work done his way. And Toohey doesn't have work he loves, and he doesn't have a way of something that he values other than destroying. And because he's a destroyer, he's the opposite, not just of Rourke philosophically as an individualist, but Rourke is a builder. And so Toohey's a knocker down, a destroyer. So I think that Toohey very much works dramatically in the Fountainhead in the way that, where would he be in Atlas Shrugged? In Atlas Shrugged, as I think it's, Andy is someone, you've pointed that out, that in Atlas Shrugged, we've got the good guys as the opponents, in the battle of the heroes. And that's actually what's going on, because we don't think of the villains in Atlas Shrugged as being, well, they're impotent. They don't have, so I think that, and Toohey is ultimately not powerful, but he certainly does a lot of damage along the way. And Rourke is great enough that he can overcome that. So I think that narratively speaking, Toohey fits much better into the Fountainhead than he would into Atlas Shrugged. However, he's very, very interesting in the sense that you might not immediately see who he is and what he is, but Ayn Rand keeps, you might say, building the pieces of him. And once you understand him, you see that in fact, his nature has been evident in every one of his actions. And that what he means by being a humanitarian isn't, everybody's the same under the skin and I'm willing to skin humanity in order to prove it. That's Ellsworth Toohey, all right. And including the fact that he has wit and that he's a person of eloquence in language, and that we first meet him as a voice, that Keating hears the voice, and the speech is powerful. And then we see him, and physically he doesn't match his voice. While with Rourke, it goes the other way. You know, we see him, you know, naked and on a cliff and laughing, and he doesn't make his big speech until the end of the book. So they kind of map onto each other, you know, opposites or reverse parallel in that way as well.
So Andy, yeah.
There's a lot of, Shoshana's raising a lot of really good points. And I think it would be a really good essay to write, you know, on Ellsworth Toohey in contrast to James Taggart, the two arch villains of the what I think are the two greatest novels in world literature. And I think Toohey is the distilled essence of an altruist collectivist philosophy. Ayn Rand's showing us without, you know, sacrifice for others, and of course politically in the macrocosm, you know, service to the state. She's showing us the distilled essence of this philosophy, this destructive philosophy, stripped of all psychological defense mechanisms that in real life would necessarily occur, because nobody could honestly face up to their own evil in real life the way Toohey does in fiction. You know, like Leonard Peikoff said when he was writing the Ominous Parallels, and he was talking about Hitler, you know, if somebody as evil as Hitler would face up to actually how evil they are, they would either lose their mind, which happens to Jim Taggart, of course, in Atlas Shrugged, or they would immediately commit suicide. So I think that's true. And so Ayn Rand has stripped away the psychological defense mechanisms here to show us the moral philosophic. This is the morality of evil. I think with James Taggart, she's shown us the psychology of evil, and that somebody as evil as James Taggart, they're both nihilists. They're both about destruction, you know, for its own sake. And I think Jim Taggart is the psychologically realistic version, that he's got to evade concepts, he's got to push aside the awareness of what his own motivations are, until at the end, he finally, at some point, the material that you've evaded becomes so powerful, it just tramples over your defense mechanisms. And when he wants to kill Galt, even though it's their only chance to survive, and you know, and 6 weeks from now he's going to be dead, and he still wants to kill him, you know, and he realizes that you know, then the full truth, that's all he's ever been, is about killing, and not just killing, but killing the best members of society, and he loses his mind as he would have to. He becomes this gibbering mass. And I think Ayn Rand's done this. Yeah, she's just masterful. She hasn't, I think, even she's starting to get some of the credit she deserves as a philosopher, a little bit. I don't think she's even remotely gotten any of the credit she deserves as a novelist. It's just masterfully done. You know, the twin villains here, the moral essence of evil and the psychological essence of it. It's really brilliant.
I mean, I'm glad you both.
I was just going to comment.
Yeah, go on. So, go
I'm sorry. Just since you mentioned that about Taggart, because it's such a striking sequence, I think that does work also in Atlas Shrugged, because we've already heard from Dr. Robert Stather, who is brilliant and who also wants Galt to die. You know, and so. And he also has to, there's the question of how much does he understand about his own nature, and what does it mean to him to recognize that he also is a destroyer. And well, if you read the book, you'll see that there's even a physical analog for that of his being a destroyer. But I think you could even put the three of them together, because from a literary point of view also, you notice that people sometimes mistakenly say that Ayn Rand just, all the bad people have all the bad characteristics, and all the good people have all the good characteristics. Well, Stather's brilliant. You know, he has ability, but look what he does with it. And so evil and talent, or lack of talent, don't necessarily go together. And, you know, intellect and goodness don't necessarily go together, because people can choose. And I think that what we have with Toohey, to go back to our book, is that he's not a stupid person. You know, and he has gifts of language. So it's not, so he's the enemy of ability, because he doesn't have abilities that he wants to use. But it's not as if he's not, you know, physically strong, he doesn't belong in the world. But it's not as if somehow, because he's foolish, he's the enemy of intellect. Instead, it's because he doesn't have values that he's the enemy of values. And so it comes back to, I mean, it is psychology, but it's also morality. I think that, and that's, I think, why it makes sense when you call him a great villain, because he is consistently an enemy of goodness. You know, he's an enemy of the root of goodness. He's an enemy of thinking. It's one of the reasons why that's something he talks about every chance he gets. You know, you've got to stop thinking.
You reminded me of something, Josh and Shoshana. I first read The Fountainhead. I was like 16. I was right on the cusp of my 17th birthday. And even though they didn't teach history in schools back then, they certainly don't teach it today in the public schools. I was always fascinated by history. And I knew something about history, especially American history. And when I first read The Fountainhead, the person who came to my mind, in comparison and contrast to Toohey, was Theodore Roosevelt, because when Teddy Roosevelt was young, he was very sickly. He had asthma. He was physically frail. And he decided, he's going to build himself up via the strenuous life, which would either kill him, or make him strong. And it reminds me of that quote attributed to Nietzsche, that what doesn't kill me, makes me strong, which is a very heroic choice on Teddy Roosevelt's part. And he went on to this great career, which in my judgment is very mixed. I mean, he did a lot of bad things in his career, but he also did some good things. By the way, I just want to point out, a lot of people don't realize, when Roosevelt was running for the presidency on the Bull Moose Party, which is actually the Progressive Party, I think it was 1912, he wanted to give a campaign speech. I think it was in Milwaukee. Somebody shot him. He went and gave the talk. He gave the campaign speech. He was bleeding, and he finally, after about an hour, he said, "I don't know if you realize it, but I just been shot. Bleeding all off of my shirt." And I mean, it's just unfathomable today. But I mean, there's real courage and physical, robust physical vitality, and you got to give him credit because he built himself up that way. Now, Toohey, I'm going to psychologize here for a minute. I don't think it's an accident that Ayn Rand depicts Toohey as this physically frail, kid as he's growing up. And I think, because he's physically frail, he's not efficacious in dealing with the physical world. Like Rourke, who's a tall, lean, muscular guy who's a construction worker and everything. Toohey doesn't have that kind of robust physicality like Roosevelt did, and Teddy Roosevelt did in his youth. It makes a very different choice. It's, instead of choosing to build himself up, he chooses to tear others down. And I think Toohey becomes a power luster. It's very clear he's a power luster. And when everything he does in the whole story is all about gaining power. And when we remember that there's power to build, and there's power to build up and there's power to destroy. Rourke has the real power, the metaphysical power to deal with reality and to construct and create and build. Toohey has the social power that he can control society, control people's lives. He's like a virus. He can get into people's souls and he could destroy them. And every single thing, Ayn Rand's so consistent. Every single thing he does in the story is all about power and power to destroy. He's like a cult leader in his private life. What does he say at one point? He says, I think it's to Elvis Gurley. He says, "My followers, oh dear, I have so many followers. I brushed them out of my hair." And his followers, he's trying to destroy them. I mean, when he's a guidance counselor at the university, he's always advising the young students away from whatever it is they love. He advises Peter Keating away from Catherine Halsey. He's trying to empty their soul of values so that he can fill it with what they want, get them to follow him blindly and lead them away from a passionate life, away from a value-laden life where they would have joy. And then although the Fountainhead is not about politics, he's the one character who links it to political issues because he has political aspirations. He's a Marxist intellectual seeking to impose a communist dictatorship in America and have power over the whole country to destroy it. And that's what he tells Keating. That's why he wants. Keating asks him, "Well, why do you want to destroy Howard?" And Keating said, "I don't want to destroy him. I want him in prison. I want him to break his spirit. One, just for there's no joy. There's no joy for Ellsworth Toohey, but just for the perverse sense of being able to watch him broken the way Jim Taggart and Atlas wants to hear Galt scream. And then also, Rourke opposes him in his own field. He can break Rourke's spirit. It's possible then that, if Rourke succeeds as he does, then he's going to be an inspiration to all these other architects and all these other people in other fields to think independently. If he could break his spirit, that shows that's what's going to happen to you, if you go against me. So he's a power luster par excellence in every arena of his life, the personal life and the social life, and it's power not to create, it's power to destroy.
And it's interesting that he sees Rourke as just one person. He might figure, okay, I've got the rest of the world, I can give up on one person. But it's just that, Rourke is such a pure, undiluted example of independence, and he can't let that stand. And I think that part of it, could be what you said, that other people will see it and they'll be inspired. And that's the sort of thing that Henry Cameron says, right? If you carry this through to the end, Howard Rourke Architects, it'll have meaning for something that runs the world and never wins acknowledgement. And, people will see that. And we've got it in the novel and The Boy on the Bicycle and so on. And Toohey doesn't want to have any of that. But I think it's also that in his own mind, and he does have a mind, if someone like Rourke is possible, then he hasn't won. And because he's interested in power and in other people, and as long as there's one person in the other people whom he's not controlling, then he's lost. Well, I think that if you're someone who's building, well, you build this, and if there's a problem, you build something else. You don't need to build everything you build needs to be yours, integrity, but you don't need to build the whole world. While someone such as Toohey, who's after power, if there's someone who's not bowing to him, he's lost. And I think as soon as he sees Rourke, he's lost. As he looks at Rourke's buildings, he knows he's lost. Johnny Stokes, the clever little boy he knew when he was young, he can't stand that. And basically any time Toohey sees someone who is independent and who has values, that's interesting to him, because that's the enemy. That's what he needs to destroy in order for him to be powerful. Because as he says in the big speech where, oh, wow, he just spells it all out. We don't want happy men. We don't want happy men. Anyone who is happy is Ellsworth Toohey's enemy. And that's the way he is all the way through. By the way, I'm just going to say it briefly, because other characters, I was telling you before we started that I'm teaching Dostoevsky's novel Demons next semester, assuming I have enough students signed up for that class. And there's a character in Dostoevsky's Demons named Verkhovensky, who is actually quite a bit like Toohey. And, because Dostoevsky was good at evil, and, when he wants to level the world, he doesn't want any scientists, he doesn't want anyone happy, and so on. Now, unfortunately, you could say Dostoevsky wasn't able to come up with a Rourke to put into his novel, and the person he wanted to be the hero was not a Rourke, and there's all sorts of consequences for the novel. But there is someone like Toohey there, and I think it's interesting because he is both morally and psychologically and even politically interested in destruction. And well, when she calls Dostoevsky calls the book Demons, and the demons can be both individuals and they can be the ideas that inspire people. So just anyway, if you like Toohey, you might want to go read Demons. And
I've never read it, so that's so now you've piqued my interest. I want to read it now.
Well, it was Ayn Rand's favorite of Dostoevsky's novels.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
That's what she said, and I can see why.
Okay.
But it really struck
the bad guys.
It really struck me as a 16-year-old reading The Fountainhead for the first time, and I was much less sophisticated in my understanding of the world and everything, but I was very surprised by how threatened Toohey was by this one guy who makes buildings. Mm-hmm. Like you would have thought maybe he was threatened by the conservative of the day, or the potential Henry Hazlitt or whatever it is, but he's threatened by a guy, you know, at the time, in my thinking, of someone who makes buildings. Why is he so threatened by an architect? There's thousands of architects out there, and you know, and there's something that I wanted to discuss with the two of you is I'd like to get onto at some point, because I think it's interesting, about Harold Lasky, who is potential influence, because he's a very interesting real life concrete version of Toohey. You know, there's a lot of similarities with Toohey in that. But before that, it's just that Toohey is kind of a psychopath, but he's not at the same time, because he is, in real life, psychopaths are people termed with antisocial personality disorder, which is the closest kind of psychological term. And you know, and when you study them in prison, when you do criminal psychology, they're very, very short range in everything they do. It's one of the defining characteristics of psychopathy, is that there is very, very little long range thinking about anything. This is why they've always made terrible soldiers. You never find real psychopaths in the army. They just can't do it. And they also, you know, traditionally they have to mimic what they see around them. They have no capacity for empathy, and so they mimic very badly, and that's why often you can spot them. And you know, so Toohey is this interesting person, because you know, the way Rand writes about him, particularly his childhood and everything, there's elements there that are traditional psychopathic early tendencies, yet he's much more sophisticated than your you know, real life versions of that. And I was wondering if there's anything you'd like to add to that. You know, when we're looking at the psychology of someone, I just find it, you know, he is in many ways a psychopath, and in many ways he's much more, goes way beyond that, because he's like, it's almost like he's a philosophical psychopath as opposed to an axe wielding psychopath. And well, hence maybe that's why you're saying he's so much more dangerous.
Well, you know, I don't have expert knowledge of psychopaths, and I hope I don't have any personal knowledge of psychopaths. Yeah. However, you mentioned a few things. One of the things you mentioned was the short range versus long range, and Ellsworth Toohey is long range in the sense that he's got a picture and he has his plan and his little groups of people and so on. So that's different. But I think that not having empathy, it's true that he doesn't feel other people's pain as pain to himself, because after all, he doesn't care for anybody, but he does seem to know what's going to bother people, and he goes after their weaknesses, the way that he goes after his father, for example. You know, we don't have enough money for this. The way he goes after his aunt Addie and Valentine's and so on, when he knows that she feels that, you know, she wishes that she had love in her life. So it's, you know, he knows what would bother people. Now, one of the interesting things, of course, is that it's limited to weaknesses. As we said before, he doesn't really understand what makes Rourke tick. And so he knows it's got something to do with buildings, and oh, the guy doesn't want his buildings messed up. Okay, I'm going to mess up one of his buildings. But even that, he doesn't really manage to succeed with that. Now, his aunt, I keep coming back to his aunt, because I think it's a very small part of the book, but it's very expressive of who he is and what he is. She says, you know, you feed on sores. And he says, then I'll never starve. Well, the reason he'll never starve with feeding on sores is if he doesn't see enough sores around him, he's going to make some more. And that's what he has to do. If he doesn't see enough weaknesses, he's going to have to make some more. He has to encourage that. And in a way, that goes along with the political agenda, because you can't take care of the needy unless people have got needs that you can meet. You can't take care of people who are lacking unless they've got lacks. And so he depends on people not being happy and successful and prosperous, even apart from the question of people who are independent wouldn't want to be helped with the kind of help that he has to offer. So I think that it's as if he gets a kind of energy from that, but of course it's a negative energy. And I don't know if that's characteristic of psychopaths, that they go out looking on purpose for people whom they can ruin, as opposed to other people being collateral damage as they go about pursuing whatever it is that they imagine that they want. Again, I'm not don't have a lot of experience there, but I think that might be a difference, because it's not as if he wants something and other people are in the way of that, except of course for power.
Right. The reference, you're right that we see a lot of Toohey's childhood, and you reminded me, when the minister, quotes Jesus, what profiteth a man to gain the whole world if he thereby loseth his soul? Young Ellsworth immediately responds, so in order to be truly wealthy, one must be a collector of souls. And the minister's about to say, what the hell? But Toohey, young Toohey wouldn't comment on it. But yeah, in Toohey's world, he's a collector of souls. And Josh, you reminded me, I don't know how much I don't know much about psychopaths, and really, hope I never meet any. But you reminded me of Stanton Samino, I don't remember, he was a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but he studied criminals and criminal behavior, and he, I think it was in Virginia, in the Virginia State Penitentiary. One of his books, it's Inside the Criminal Mind, I remember reading a long time ago, and he talks about how criminals are overwhelmingly, they're very short term, in their interest. They're very impulsive rather than thoughtful, and everything. So years later, having read Samino's book a long time ago, years later, I think it was in the 90s. Did you guys ever see the Nicolas Cage, John Malkovich film Con Air?
Yeah.
You're in Con Air. John Malkovich plays the serial killer Cyrus the Virus, and they take over the plane, and Cyrus tells the pilot, I think he's got the gun to the pilot, says, you're going to do this, that, the other thing. And the pilot says, I'm not going to do that. And and Cyrus the Virus says, I'm going to kill you. And the pilot says, nah, you won't kill me, Cyrus. And Cyrus says, well, why not? And the pilot says, well, who's going to fly the plane once I'm dead? And Cyrus the Virus answers, I never think that far ahead. It was so perfect, for the short range mentality. And yet, you're right, that's not Toohey. Toohey's got a long range plan. He's more like Hitler in that regards. Going way back, the Nazis, the National Socialist Party doesn't come to political power in Germany until 1933. At least 10 years before that. I think it was when Hitler was in prison for the failed putsch, the beer hall putsch. He was writing his book Mein Kampf, and he lays out his plan that you're going to take over in Germany, and then we're going to build up the military. We're going to conquer the world. We're going to enslave the inferior races. He has a long range plan. So Hitler's a lot more intelligent than most of these criminals, but he's not a genius of evil the way Ellsworth Toohey is. So you're right. If psychopathology involves being short range, then Toohey is not. He has a long range plan. He's not the dictator like Hitler is, but he's the intellectual advisor behind the throne, and he's going to set up some political strongman, some Stalin, a Mao type. These guys are thugs. Mao was a thug. And he's got to run policy for a whole nation disastrously as it is. He needs intellectual advisors when he's not killing them. He needs intellectual advisors, and there's Toohey, behind the throne, whispering in the thug's ear on what policy to make. It's it's Attila and the Witch Doctor, as Ayn Rand describes it brilliantly, and for the new intellectual. And Toohey's the witch doctor with a long range plan. So if psychopathology involves short range, limited to short range like Cyrus the Virus, and Toohey's not that guy.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Stanton Samino, because I think his book has gone through several different editions and he's updated it and so on. But I think he had, and it was based on actual criminals whom he'd known and identifying through talking with them the way that they think. And of course, the way that they think when he actually follows them, and what it takes for them in order to think better and not be criminals anymore. Now, I actually talked with Stanton Samino once, because I was assigning some chapters from his book, and of course I was teaching Crime and Punishment and various other criminals, and noticing that even someone such as Raskolnikov, who thinks that he's not a common criminal, does in fact have some of the qualities of the Samano criminal as described in the book. And I guess something about my course must have been up online, and he found out about it and he wanted to talk. And he was, you know, he said, yes, you find some of these qualities not just in actual criminals, but in people who've got those tendencies. And in criminals, it's that they are that way more of the time, and that the short range thinking, the rules don't apply to me, compartmentalizing, thinking that being nice to their mother makes them good people, sort of thing. And no, it was, I recommend his books. And I think a few years ago, I read the most recent edition, which must have been the third or the fourth or something. So I don't know if he's still with it and updating the book, but I would certainly recommend that. And and that's the Inside the Criminal Mind is the popular version. And then there's also the research that he did with a collaborator over the course of many years that it's based on. Now, when you look at Toohey, he does say, you know, I'm dangerous, I ought to be locked up. And he's got some of the qualities, though not all of them, of, you know, of that kind of Samano criminal, because it is true that criminals don't think of themselves as being criminals. You know, that's what they do. That's not what they are, or something like that. And with Toohey, I think that when he actually explains things to Peter Keating, it's all coming out in a way that he has not allowed it to come out to other people before. And there's a scene just before then when he's talking with Gus Webb, and he says, I wish I had someone, you know, to talk to who could understand. Right? Remember that? Yeah. And then Peter Keating walks in and he talks to him. Now, the question is, does Peter Keating understand this? Peter Keating doesn't have to understand this. It's almost as if Toohey just has to say it. You know, this is, as he says, this is the speech I never had a chance to give. And well, maybe there's both it's irresistible to him to express what he hasn't said, even though, of course, he's been living this way for so much of his life. But part of the way he's done it is by not saying what he's doing. So I find that interesting. You know, that it's sort of as if that's his moment of facing up to it. And yet it's not with shame, but it's as if he couldn't keep quiet anymore. And, you know, I mean, he talks, he's paragraph upon paragraph, he can't stop. And can you sort of imagine Peter Keating sitting there and doesn't know what's hit him?
Just in terms of like sort of villains in general, in which, you know, he does suffer from the Bond villain aspect of needing to explain. You know, the Bond villain always comes unstuck.
Oh, yes,
they always have to explain themselves, and then Bond gets out of it.
And then we can shoot them. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's an element of that in a more sophisticated form with Toohey. You know, his esteem in that sense is so, like, he needs that to be recognized by someone else in his, you know, in that kind of his behavior. And it's you see that.
Yes. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. Yeah.
He's the ultimate second-hander. And so he lives like a virus inside, you know, a spiritual virus inside the minds of other people. So it's understandable that he would crave, you know, this kind of recognition for his being a genius of evil. There's a couple of points I want to make about Toohey before. I know we're going to run out of time soon, but one of them is about what Shoshana, you were saying when he was talking to Gus Webb, and this is, you know, the book was published in 1943 and written, you know, in the seven preceding years. And Ellsworth Toohey is classic old left. You know, he's intellectual. He's very refined. You know, he's classy villain. He's well dressed. You know, he speaks beautifully. He's highly intelligent. You know, he's an architecture critic. You know, he's a writer. You know, and he's a very, very, very intelligent mind. He's not a genius like Rourke, but he's a very, very intelligent mind. And had he made better choices in his life, he could have been a brilliant critic, in the field. It's always going to be secondhand. It's going to be, not doing creative work himself, but analyzing the works of others. But still, there's value in that, right? There's value in being a rational critic. Like if some film critic or some some book critic was actually do a great job on in the newspapers on Ayn Rand's novels, it would be enormously valuable. That's not the choice he makes. But anyway, he's classic old left. And Gus Webb says that Gus Webb's kind of, slovenly, and he doesn't wash behind his ears, and he likes to chant obscenities at well-dressed ladies on Fifth Avenue. And Gus Webb says to him, he says, "You think you're the man of the future, Ellsworth?" He says, "You're not. I am." And Toohey says, sadly, "You're right, Gus." And here's Ayn Rand in the 1930s and 1940s predicting the inevitable devolution of the left from the intellectual old left into the activist new left of the 1960s, a good 20 years before they arrive on the cultural scene in 1965 with the Mario Savio and the free speech movement at Berkeley. And Ayn Rand pointed out the left has to devolve. This is not stated in the Fountainhead, but she understands, because it has to devolve and continue to devolve as it has into Marxist terrorist organizations like Antifa and Black Lives Matter. I want to burn this bleep down, because the influence here is ultimately Marxism. Marxism is all about class warfare. It's all about brute violence. It's about destruction of the good. Marxism and its class warfare is really a philosophy of, for, and by envy-riddled psychopaths who seek to destroy people who've succeeded and who can live well. So Ayn Rand's predicting in the character of Gus Webb, the arrival of the new left 20 years later. And one other point from what you said earlier, Shoshana, was really interesting. When you're right, Toohey says for that one moment he was tempted to destroy the agreement, actually do something good, in the world. And I think what Ayn Rand's showing us, it would be akin to, like, here's Hitler in the midst of his mass murder campaign. He finds some poor waif on the street who's hungry and starving and has nobody to take care of, and feels a moment of, have to be an Aryan waif, of course, but feels a moment of compassion and gives the kid some food, or something like that. And I think what Ayn Rand's showing us there is that there may well be some last spark of humanity in the monster, but it's completely trivial. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. It's a tiny little grain of sand on a vast beach of evil, and so it doesn't have any broad impact or deep impact in the world. So these people who say, well, there's a little bit of good in the worst of us, as stated, that might literally be true, but doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
It
could be, but we don't even know for sure. Maybe it's something that he's saying to Peter Keating, or it's something that he says to himself. And after all, as you say, it doesn't matter. I think what you're saying about Gus Webb is completely right, because boy, Gus Webb, he's just a minor character, but Ayn Rand really runs with him. Gus Webb says, "Oh, it's too bad about Cortlandt. He should have blown it up with a few kids inside." Right, and right. When in fact, Rourke went to a lot of trouble, what with, Dominique and the Night Watchman and so on, so that there wouldn't be any people involved. Right. And well, just so it's not
good for the movement. Good for the movement. If Rourke killed a bunch of kids, that's Gus Webb. We don't care about human life. What we care about is the establishment of the work estate. And what we really care about is the destruction of the good for being the good. So if we have all this bloody collateral damage and kill a bunch of kids, that doesn't matter. It's just collateral damage. The good is that which furthers the Marxist revolution. That's the mentality here. And
yet except I think that part of what we have with Toohey right here in the scene is that he was trying to talk to Alva about Alva Scarrett, and now we take over the wine and papers. This is what is this? And he doesn't get it at all until he says, "Oh gee, you're a fool. I wish I had someone to talk to." And then he tries to talk to Gus Webb. That doesn't help either. that doesn't, he wants to talk to, and then he finally falls back on Peter Keating. And what you were saying before about the Bond villain, I think that's some of it, that he wants someone to appreciate, but these are not people who would appreciate him. And he wanted to talk to Rourke back at the end of part 2, and we saw how that worked out. So there's some sense in which he's wanting acknowledgement from someone outside himself, and even for his evil, he's not going to get that.
Yeah, and I think something that's come around to me while going through. Earlier on we were discussing a bit about is he that real in terms of, and Andy beautifully concretized elements of Roosevelt being, and when you were talking about that, I found that very interesting. But I think Ayn Rand, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, based Toohey sort of on this British socialist called Harold Lasky. And I don't know if you've ever seen a photo of him, but he's this kind of wispy, very refined, well dressed,
hair parted, glasses.
And he was a professor at the London School of Economics, and he was a absolute textbook Marxist. He actually got expelled from the Labour Party for being for the Labour Party. One sort of redeeming grace at the time was that they were non-violent. They believed in non-violence, protest and takeover. And Lasky actually was expelled because of his covert hinting at wanting violent uprising, and he was usurped, by the next generation of the left, and I love what you pointed out there in terms of, it's the Gus Webbs are going to be the ones, the thugs are going to be taking over, the even more nihilist in a way version.
Yeah, Gus Webb's just a step along the way. He's Mario Savio, the free speech movement in Berkeley in 1965. Yeah. He's a step along the way. He's not yet Antifa, or Black Lives Matter.
And Toohey used to be religious, and then he discovered socialism.
Right.
So that's even explicit within there, even though we don't we don't have quotations from Marx or anything, but it's as if that became his new way, a way of defining what the ultimate foundation was for his version of nihilism. I think you were mentioning Lasky a minute ago, and just to be fair, it's not as if Ayn Rand was a big reader of Lasky, but she was, familiar with him and with things about him, and she did make a point of accepting an invitation to go with some friends of hers to a lecture in order to see him as in person. And she said, oh yeah, that, and I've never seen a movie of him. So I've seen pictures, but I haven't seen a movie. But she said, yeah, it's just sort of seeing him, the way that he talked, and the sneering as opposed to passionate way that he talked. And she said, yeah, that's Toohey, the above it all, the elegance, the someone who can be a brute, but in elegant form. That was interesting to her, because the brute in brute form is Gus Webb, but Ellsworth Toohey, he's got a name like Ellsworth Toohey. Ellsworth Toohey does not sound like a thug's name, even though, as you say, it's the roots of thuggery. She had two other models in mind, and one of them was a leftist columnist, Haywood Brown, and Broun, and Lewis Mumford, who was a writer on architecture and civilization and things like that. I think that the issue with Lasky is that she actually made a point to go and see him. And she went, by the way, with Pincus Berner, who was one of her lawyers. And one kind of fun thing about Ayn Rand is that she ended up becoming friends with some of her lawyers, and that, sort of they defended her and she agreed with them, and then they became lifelong friends. And Pinky, not for his politics, but Pinky short for Pincus, was one of those. And that was how she ended up being able to see Harold Lasky in person.
Interesting. I think, we could talk about Toohey in the same way that we could talk about, I think, all of Ayn Rand's major characters for a long, long time. But, we could go on for hours, but I think it's really important that, we have to wind down now. I really hope, I've really enjoyed and loved listening to the two of you riffing like I always do. And, I'm greatly appreciative of your time. And I think, if people have Was there anything that either of the two of you want to add in case people watching this want to take things further? In terms of, other things to read or you two have much more expert insight into this than I do. But I'm just wondering, like, if, let's say I just read The Fountainhead for the first time and I wanted to know more, are there, apart from rereading it, are there any other things that the two of you suggest?
Well, Robert Mayhew's collection of essays on The Fountainhead, I think, is very good. Shoshana and I both contributed to it. I could pat myself on the back. I think it is certainly very good for people who want to, deeper insight into this great book.
Yeah. And anything you'd add, Shoshana?
Well, I basically think that you can always read The Fountainhead again.
Yeah, there you go.
Because there's always more in The Fountainhead to appreciate. And one question that might be worth thinking about just, one more time through is, why is it that we need literarily Toohey in this book? Because I think someone else might have written a book about Rourke and Keating, the two of them, and following their careers all the way through. And that would be the book. And it wouldn't even be a bad book. It'd be a book about the independent architect and the second-hander conformist architect and the two of their careers. But when you think about it, by the time we get to the end of part 1 of the book, we can clearly see that beating Keating is not very interesting because he's small potatoes. And Toohey is not exactly big potatoes, but there's more to him than there is to Keating. And so we've got some interest in what does it mean for Rourke actually to win against Toohey with everything that he's got. Of course, ultimately, Rourke has to win against the pessimistic view expressed by Dominique and Wynand, who seems to her to mean, yeah, that's it, the bad guys win. But still, I think that if we need Toohey is important in the novel, and that's even a way that something you would think about as you read it next time. Could we just take Toohey out? What would we be missing?
That's a good point, Shoshana. The book would be more like Arrowsmith than
yes,
than like The Fountainhead.
Yeah,
it's always great to have a great villain.
Yes,
for many reasons.
No, I'm glad you mentioned Arrowsmith, because that's another. It really is in a lot of ways a parallel literary attempt. It even starts similarly. Ayn Rand has that analysis where she looks at the scene where Arrowsmith first goes to see Gottlieb, and you contrast that with the way that Rourke goes to see Cameron.
Right.
Yeah, those are, yeah, and there it is. But we don't have anything like Toohey and Arrowsmith, because that wasn't the way that Sinclair Lewis thought. Although, and maybe I could make this a last word, I think that there's a villain in It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis, and his name is Effingham Swan. Okay, and I think there's something of, he's not a major big bad character, but there's something Toohey-like about him, because he's the violent character who conceals it with what appears to be wit, and nothing is very important, and it's all a matter of style and so on. I could almost see the same actor playing the two of them, Effingham Swan and Toohey.
Lovely.
So
that's a lovely ending. Thank you both very much, and look forward to speaking with the two of you soon.
Great to be here. Thanks, Josh and Rosie, for setting us up.
And thank you, Andy.
And you too, Shoshana.